Buona serata a tutti. Questa serata si svolge in inglese, quindi English. For a very short welcome address, I would like to thank, above all, Carol Veil for her proposal to host this event. Those who are in Venice know that our institutions, the Peggy Guggenheim Collection and Palazzo Grassi, try to work together and to create as much synergy as possible for the benefit of the public. So this conference has a link, of course, with the exhibition currently held at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, but I'm sure that the themes which are going to be developed will resonate with our own program, in particular with the exhibition at Punta da Dogana, Lorna Simpson, Paolo Nazareth, especially. So I would like also to welcome Erica Wall, but I won't thank everyone. That's the duty of Carol Veil. Mine is much shorter, and I would like also to welcome those who will attend the meeting online because there's streaming tonight. So enjoy the evening. Warm thanks also to the distinguished speakers, Naomi Beckwith and Lucy Bradnock. We are going to, and I pass the floor immediately to Erica Wall, I think.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Should I do this? Okay, I'm short, so. Okay. Well, my name is Erica Wall, and I am the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine. Yes, I am very, very far from home, but what an amazing place to be in, especially at an amazing time. I just wanted to shortly tell you a little bit about the Lunder Institute, but also to thank all of you for being here and being part of this program. The Lunder Institute, for all intents and purposes, is a think tank. It is a think tank for the Colby Museum of Art, for the field of American art, and for the art world at large. And so this particular program, Lunder Institute at, was created as a vehicle for institutions to be in conversation. And it is a very special year for us in the United States as we acknowledge the 250th anniversary of our independence. So with that, we put together a very special cohort, one of which museum is the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, along with the Yale Center for British Art, the Royal Academy of Art, and the Tate Britain, to be in conversation and answer the question, what is the state of American art? Because our focus is to really look at the relationships and the significant figures that influence, shape what we understand to me American art and its history. And so with that, we are so excited and pleased to be in partnership with the Peggy Guggenheim Collection today. And I also want to say that the intersection of what we do lands in research, art making, and scholarship. So it really encompasses all. And it takes a lot to do these programs, and I want to extend my thank you to the entire staff at the PGC. And I want to start off by thanking Carol B. Veil, its director, but also Grazina Subalite, Elena Minarelli, Michaela Parata, Maria Rita Sorelli, and of course, Naomi Beckwith and Lucy Bradnock, who graciously accepted the invitation to be our speakers, and of course, our host, the Palazzo Grassi. And this unique platform and container is really made possible by Peter and Paula Lunder and the Lunder Foundation. Without them, the Institute would not exist, and we could not have these conversations, not just in Maine, but also across the world. And so we thank them, and we thank you and the PGC for being in partnership with us and having these conversations to explore the state of American art. So with that, I will hand it off to Carol.
Thank you so much. Io invece parlo in italiano. Buonasera. Good evening, everyone.
Warm greeting and thanks to all of you for being here this evening on the occasion of this meeting. Tonight's event is entitled Migrating with Forms and explores the evolution of North American art in a global perspective and the transatlantic dialogues that have influenced its creation, circulation and reception. The initiative is promoted by the Lunder Institute for American Art of the Colby College Museum of Art, and it has involved some important international institutions, as Erica Wall has just mentioned, the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, the Royal Academy, the Tate Britain, and the Yale Center for British Art, to critically reflect on the history of North American art. Allow me to welcome our rapporteurs, Naomi Beckwith, Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Guggenheim in New York, and Lucy Bradnock, Dean for Research at the Courtauld Institute of Art and Scholar of Modern and Contemporary Art. I thank them for the work they have done and for choosing to reread some aspects of Peggy Guggenheim's legacy through innovative perspectives and questioning consolidating narratives, giving space to voices and stories that have often remained on the margins. I greet and thank the members of the Advisory Committee and the trustee of the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation who are present this evening. I thank Erica Wall, Director of the Lunder Institute for American Art, for her presence and for inviting the collection to participate in this program of international research and dialogue. I want to thank the Colby College Museum of Art for supporting the project. And finally, I thank my colleague Bruno Racine and Palazzo Grassi, Punta della Godagana, for their generous hospitality in this splendid space by Tadawando. Collaborations like these can offer the territory and the communities of reference of our institutions valuable opportunities for in-depth study and content of great value. And I'm very glad for this evening. And at this point, I would pass the floor to our speakers. Enjoy listening.
Buonasera a tutti. I don't know if that was correct, but that is my way of acknowledging that I'm happy to be here in Italy this evening. And I want to start by thanking you all for being here this evening, but especially thanking our inviters and host. Thank you to the wonderful Teatrino at Palazzo Grassi. Thank you, Signor Racine and your entire team for having us. Always, of course, thrilled to be invited into another think tank session. So thank you, Erica Walla, and of course everyone at the Lunder Institute for thinking of myself and Lucy as part of this deep dive into the state of American art this year. But of course, many, many thanks to my colleagues at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, Carol Vell especially, Gracina Sibelita, who I think is around here somewhere, yes, and especially this time to Elena Minarelli, who really coordinated our time here in Venice. Thank you so much. I'm so happy, of course, to be in conversation with my dear colleague Lucy Bradnock tonight. And we thought that our conversation may not give you an exact synopsis of what is happening in American art right now, but really we would have more of a conversation about the foundations of what constitutes the definition of American art. Where are those roots, and how can we go back to those? So with that, I'll dive into some notes that I wrote to help the translators. So forgive me for not being more dynamic, but this is the easiest way to have a discussion. So we're here thrilled not only to be thinking about American art, but specifically about the impact of Peggy Guggenheim's relatively brief but brilliant time in New York, and also the greater social and historical ideas that shaped modernism in the United States. So here is the lady herself, posed in front of two very impressive Jackson Pollock paintings in a way that quite literally foregrounds her role in shaping Pollock's career and stature as arguably the most important artist in United States history. Except this is not a photograph. It's a photoshopped collage that was created in a way that actually only serves to prove my point. Random fans depict Peggy Guggenheim, who spent actually the majority of her career, her art collecting career in Europe, as one of the single most iconic figures in the development of modern American art. Guggenheim's contribution was through her collecting practice, buying a painting a day, as she said, and her smart cataloging of that collection, published in the book The Art of the Century, and in 1942, opening her visionary gallery in New York, which she gave the same name as her book, The Art of the Century. She gave Pollock his first show in 1943, continuing to do so until she closed the space in 1947. Guggenheim recognized Pollock's intellectual synthesis of surrealism and abstraction, two European avant-garde movements that she championed equally, yet also understood Pollock's intensely physical gestural forms were an altogether new visual language that would grow into a new visual art movement, the first art movement to supplant academic European art traditions. Guggenheim was one of a small but mighty group who identified and propelled what became the New York School into international fame, collecting, displaying, and writing about these emergent forms. The powerful art critic Clement Greenberg regularly reviewed her exhibitions at the Art of the Century, while also making prescriptions for how art should look and behave. Starting in the late 1930s, Greenberg railed against social realism, figuration, arguing that his era's modern art should be heroic, expressionistic, and divorced from anything that locates it in a specific history. It should, above all, be disconnected from narrative and from politics. This, in fact, was a big political detour for Greenberg, who was once a Trotskyite Marxist, but simply abandoned these convictions. And I suspect that perhaps the nascent anti-communism in the US and a movement that also had deep anti-Semitic characters probably had something to do with Greenberg's conversion. But I would argue that Greenberg, who called for nothingness in art, was writing within the narrative tradition of American innocence. Historians, such as Robert Strassfeld, and literary critics, such as Leslie Fiedler, argue the ideal of American innocence, the ideal that the United States was an empty land, without history, free from Europe's oppressive terrors, and that America's democratic, pro-wealth commitments are what make it distinct in the world, are also always a force for good. And I would argue that the visual arts were just as susceptible to this romance of American innocence. For instance, consider this quote from Adolf Gottlieb. There is a general assumption that European, specifically French, painters have a heritage which enables them to have the benefits of tradition, and therefore they can produce a certain type of painting, end quote. Gottlieb's expressed anxiety is based on the idea that there was no history to draw upon in the US to give their painting a subject. In other words, American artists had nothing to paint about. Yet Clement Greenberg turned this void into an asset, leaning into the idea that the modern canvas, like the United States, was a blank slate. And this all sounds wonderfully freeing, but for me it also sounds like a bit of rubbish. I personally am very wary of any tabula rasa argument, as it was the same argument used to expropriate land from indigenous communities in the United States. The argument was that there was no one there. So, if America is not innocent, what is it? Friedler, the literary critic, has an antidote, which is to say that the opposite of innocence is not guilt, but responsibility. Responsibility involves wholly accepting and knowing what has preceded you, acknowledging you have borrowed or even stolen from other cultures, embracing all aspects of yourself, good and bad, and bringing it into your history and aesthetic narrative. As such, I gladly take on the responsibility for things that the fiction of American innocence may obscure or leave out entirely. Particularly of interest for me is the Black presence at key moments in the development of American modernism. For instance, Gottlieb made his above comment in April 1950 at a historic but almost forgotten 3-day gathering of about 25 painters at a downtown space called Studio 35. This group of painters, many of whom had been exhibited at Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery, were still trying to define what they did, what made it distinctive, and what to call themselves. Because at that time, their work lacked a discernible subject matter. And the term abstract expressionist hadn't yet been applied to them. But happily, they came up with a terrible name called intrasubjectivist, and it didn't stick. But in my early education, I wasn't taught that Black painters were there at that early moment. But as it turns out, a painter like Hill Woodruff was the teacher of many of these artists. And he actually was one of the co-funders of Studio 35, getting that space together so that painters would have, young painters especially, would have a place to gather. And Norman Lewis was another African-American artist contributing to this set of conversations and, of course, this new American art movement. Though, as the U.S. is generally segregated, so were the major collecting practices until very recently in the country, which means that Black artists were barely represented in major mainstream private or public collections in the 20th century. And that said, I very much relish the opportunity to foreground some of these Black pioneers now. So, though somewhat anxious, these gatherings of these artists here in 1950 weren't actually so naive as to believe that their work was starting from nothing. Because Gottlieb, who was quoted earlier about not having a certain tradition, later goes on to say, quote, "It seems to me that in the last 50 years, the whole meaning of painting has been made international. I think the Americans share that heritage just as much, and that if they deviate from tradition, it is just as difficult for an American as it is for a Frenchman." End quote. Gottlieb's understanding of modernism was weighted with history, and his awareness of practices exchanging across the Atlantic, and he had an awareness, I should say, of practices exchanging across the Atlantic and around the world. His statement, in fact, sounds like a precursor to our current global era. Sorry. And it very well may be that precursor. The irony is that the New York School represented the first truly independent American modernism, but that it also was the very end of American modernism. The 1960s, which followed, ushered in what was to be known as postmodernism, a complicated and multifaceted explosion of many media and gestures. The movement and the period had its many problems and complications, but it very intentionally opened up the doors that Greenberg closed and allowed for a discussion of social issues, politics, and the things that critics thought had actually degraded art practices. It also saw the mass opening and arrival for many African American artists. And I would like to leave you with a little bit of a sample of artists who have walked through those sort of gestural and psychological models that someone like Peggy Guggenheim first fostered in the United States. Because this is actually a part of Peggy Guggenheim's legacy in the United States. There are, for instance, potent feminist gestures in the surreal works of Leonore Feeney, but those forms and themes are later taken up as the very personification of exploitation and enslavement by someone like the contemporary artist Kara Walker. Or we should consider the ways in which Jean Dubuffet's faux naive materiality and weighty psychological explorations now find echoes in Rashid Johnson's cartoonish depictions of anxiety rendered in domestic materials. And finally, let's think about the way that Mark Tobey's all-over calligraphic works offer this cartographic sensation seen in the contemporary work of an artist like Mark Bradford. But most immediately, I would argue, in the energetic collaged canvases of an artist like Shanique Smith, who always understood gestural abstraction as a form of writing within art history. And I personally very much enjoy taking up the responsibility for writing art history with these contemporary artists. Thank you. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Lucy.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to think with us and with the works in the Peggy Guggenheim Collection about the state of American art. It's such a treat to be part of these conversations, and I know that there are conversations happening at institutions and in departments across this country and across this continent, and indeed internationally, at what feels like a very exciting time for American art and for American art historians. Thank you to the Peggy Guggenheim Collection for hosting us this evening, to the Lunder Institute, and to the Palazzo Grassi for generously inviting us into this really magnificent space. And thank you to Naomi for opening up so many productive questions, for thinking about Peggy Guggenheim's role in shaping American modernism, but also in forging a path for the kind of rich legacies that you have begun to sketch out. And I hope to kind of pick up some of those threads in offering my thoughts this evening. In thinking through these questions, I've been thinking a lot about the operation of myth in the works that Peggy Guggenheim showed and collected, but also in the narratives that we tell about them, about American art, and indeed about America and the Americas. I've been thinking about what it means to think with those works here in Venice, and now 2.5 decades into the 21st century, and to bring to that immediate post-Second World War moment a kind of perspective from our present moment. So in the next few minutes, I want to address some of the questions that I see currently animating the field of American art history, and that circle around the shifting and often contested idea of Americanness historically and in the present moment, the legacy of American mythologies, that idea of innocence that you sketched out, Naomi, and how it came to be articulated as wilderness, both culturally and also literally in terms of that idea of the tabula rasa. I'm interested in the relation of the human to the natural world that underpins that notion of emptiness or of wilderness. And in all of these, I'm interested in how the mid-century works in the Peggy Guggenheim Collection help us to think about American art and the American cultural imaginary in what I'm going to describe as the age of ecology. And in doing so, it's really an attempt to push back against that notion of emptiness, to think about the way in which these abstract works are not placeless and not devoid of history. I will also open with Pollock's Moon Woman, that merging of surrealism, abstraction, and that new energy that became to be characterized via the rhetoric of the New York School. Its title combining myth, astronomy, and archetypal, some might say stereotypical, notions of the feminine. The work is typically read via Jungian psychology, in which the moon represents the feminized, intuitive side of the self to the sun's logical, masculinist ego. It also, I think, has something to tell us about Pollock's investment in cultural models of natural cycles and powers, the gendering of the natural world, and the long history of understanding our own interior selves as separate from it, even as this moon woman governs our exterior and interior selves. Guggenheim was fundamental in shaping and defining what came to be known as the New York School. But the American artists who she championed were not all from or based in New York. In 1946, she mounted the first solo exhibition in New York devoted to the work of the West Coast abstract painter Clyfford Still, whose vertically oriented painting Jamais she acquired for her collection, and it's on view as we speak. In 1946, Still was as geographically and culturally removed from Manhattan as the European artists whose work Peggy was collecting and showing at her gallery Art of This Century. Debuted in New York, Jamais was made in Richmond, Virginia, by an artist born in North Dakota, raised in Spokane, Washington, on a wheat ranch across the Canadian border in southern Alberta, and who moved to Northern California in the early 1940s. Still's biography operated far outside the Europe-New York axis that for a long time was a familiar frame for abstract expressionism, and it was certainly the frame for American art writ large as I studied it as a student now some decades ago. And I'm being deliberately vague about how long ago that actually was. Even as Still's work has been read in dialogue with the European artists whose work Guggenheim was showing at Art of This Century, it's also been linked to ideas about American place and land. Building on Mark Rothko's declaration in the 1946 catalogue that the work invoked the classical myth of Persephone, whose mother Demeter brought famine when her daughter was abducted to the underworld, the painting has been read in relation to seasons and agrarian landscapes. In the early 1990s, the scholar of abstract expressionism David Anfam interpreted Still's work as intimately connected to the migration of his family and to larger and longer histories of the settlement of the prairies and homesteading of the American Western states. Anfam asked how we might read Still's work as carrying forward into abstraction the ecological and social catastrophe of the Great Depression, its relentless toughness, its semi-arid landscapes, its histories of Dust Bowl misery, destitution, and survival. This reading places Still's painting, which hovers on the edge of abstraction, as related to the myths and cycles of nature and the agrarian imaginary, in which the shadowy figure in the center moves among yellow striations that read as corn stalks, and next to a blood-red circle that suggests the sinking sun. And a similar reading of wheat or cornfields is tempting in the case of Willing de Kooning's yellow-dominated untitled painting, also in the Peggy Guggenheim Collection. Still, for his part, declared that his paintings of the 1940s were of the earth, of the damned. More recently, in 2015, Art historian Patricia Failing foregrounded Still's late 1930s depictions on paper of local indigenous inhabitants of the Colville Reservation in northeastern Washington state, arguing that they're related to his use of color and the abstracted figures in his later paintings. That abstract expressionist painters were influenced by indigenous visual forms and practices is well known, though that indigenous abstract artists were also among their number and participated in many of the same exhibitions as their non-native peers is less often acknowledged. Among them, Chippewa artist George Morrison's declaration that in this search for my own reality, I seek the power of the rock, the magic of the water, the religion of the tree, the color of the wind, and the enigma of the horizon, invites us to link abstract gestural painting techniques to landscape forms, energy, and agents, even as abstraction apparently moved away from direct landscape representation and was claimed as non-political, non-place-oriented, and non-historical. In some senses, Jamais is a painting about wayfinding in the natural and supernatural world, one that does not depict nature or landscape per se, but reveals it via a set of symbols, signs, and invocations as formed out of myth. And I want to think here about the way in which Still, and I think this applies to other abstract expressionist painters, also not only deploys myth as a method and a mode, but also perhaps we might see myth and its procedures of meaning making as his subject, which is to say that I think he is very consciously concerned with myth in the American context. Other works in the Peggy Guggenheim Collection enable us to think about myth in this way, either as demarcating human separation from the natural world, or as entangling us in its rhythms, cycles, and elemental forces. And they do so, I would argue, And they do so, I would argue, in a way that invites us to consider the role of myths about nature in the foundational conception of the United States. Could we understand the tangled skeins of Pollock's enchanted forest in this way too, even as they eschew representation and depth in favor of pattern, surface, and energy? Pollock's title gestures towards the unknown of the natural world, conjuring myths of wilderness that are foundational to ideas of manifest destiny and the forests that once covered the American continent. It also suggests a wild space that is alive with agential forces that are not human. Myth thus operates in relation to themes of fertility, creativity, and poetic or mystical metamorphosis. But it also conjures a set of stories that narrate our place in the world, in particular our relation with the natural world and the more than human beings that inhabit it. In the context of American art, I want to suggest these ideas take on a particular political valence. To read modern, sometimes abstract American art in this way situates it in relation to longer histories of American painting, narratives of regionalism and the frontier, and attitudes to nature that shaped articulations of nationhood. These ideas offer a different way of thinking through the influence on Pollock and others of the regionalist painting of Thomas Hart Benton and his colleagues. These frames also place these historic works in dialogue with later practices that both enact and disrupt mythologies of the natural world and our place within it, including from a gendered perspective. We might look, for example, and I've given you a teaser of this already, to the work of Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta, whose Silhouettes series comprised the artist incising her body into the muddy Iowa ground to create what she termed earth body sculptures as being in and of the earth, and documented in photography. Like stills jamais, the silhouettes hover between representation and abstraction, and they deploy myth to enact the close relation of body to earth, creating shadowy traces that invoke ritualized forms to express our relation with the natural world. Mendietta's work invites us to consider the gendered terms of the abstract expressionists' engagement with both myth and the natural world, filtered through myths that frame the natural cycles in feminized terms and that in turn reinforce the masculinist framing of the artist-creator. In a more recent work by contemporary artist Dion Lee, we see her hands tearing at the printed magazine page, an old Nature magazine, showing a picture of a waterfall amidst dense greenery, another enchanted forest. Here, though, Lee's hands tear apart the spell, revealing the image to be all surface, all construction, a wilderness conjured by settler pioneers and available for the benefit of some but not others. The work that Guggenheim championed, supported, showed, and collected has become canonical in histories of American art, but it remains difficult to pin down. Evidence of the complex ways in which these mid-century artists forged a new category of American art, but one that was more tied to America's histories and ideologies than it might at first have seemed, and was often claimed by critics at the time. I'll leave you then with a series of questions that have been preoccupying me in preparation for this evening's discussion. What are the rifts that run through these works? What new points of reference to these works encourage or enable in the 21st century? What does it mean to think with them about American art and ecology today? And to do so in Venice, where the dynamics and entanglements of the global art world and the effects of the planetary climate crisis are felt particularly profoundly. Thank you.
So we both started with a little bit of a position paper, let's say, but now we're turning to more of an open discussion because Lucy and I wanted to do that, but we thought it would be important maybe to ground our thinking a little bit at first. And I want to maybe lob the first question at you, Lucy, because you ended with some. But I also want to first acknowledge that one of the joys of being here today with you is that we are both social art historians, I would say. That might be a slightly old-fashioned term, but there's a way in which we always think of art as embedded in history, always embedded in kind of a form of thinking and politics of its moment. And I think it's really interesting that we've both taken up these ideas in our career of history, maybe what's going on in the real. But in the talk today, we've actually gone into fiction and really been interested in not the sort of real events that have motivated art practices, but in terms of maybe the stories that we've told each other. And Lucy, you actually said to me as we were preparing for this, there was a sense among American artists that Europe had too much history. Right, there's just too much history there, and that it was really important for Americans to get away from that. And without planning it, we both took up this question of mythology, both took up this question of fictions. We really did not actually plan to do this tonight. And I want to maybe lob one of your questions back at you. As you ask, like, what does it mean? What rifts actually have been exposed in the ways that we have been thinking about this artist historically, and maybe what sort of myths have we uncovered, and what do we need to maybe jettison from the story of American art, in your opinion?
Thank you. I think we're both kind of thinking through the role of history, which I would argue is as much about fiction and storytelling as it is about fact. And I think we see that when we look at the works that Peggy was showing in her gallery. I think a lot of the narrative of a kind of tabula rasa of American art as separating and this narrative of rupture from Europe comes from critics writing about those works, not from the artists, and actually not from Guggenheim herself. And if we go back and attend to the way in which those works are being shown in her gallery, to the attention that she is paying to the connections between American artists and European artists, we don't find that they are doing the same thing, but we absolutely find that there are these common concerns between them, and that American artists are looking both to European history and also, I would argue, to the history of their own nation as one that is deeply rooted in conceptions of place, conceptions of nature. It is a different history, but it is a very fertile history for them to mine through the model of myth, I think. The mythologies that they're looking at, yes, come from Europe, but are applied in the context of the United States, and I think that is really crucial.
I mean, I think it's interesting that the idea of there is the potent idea in psychoanalysis that mythology is actually the stories of our own psyche. And one of the things that happens, I think, in both of Guggenheim's program in London and in New York is that a program is also deeply based on surrealism to a certain extent. And she thought of these American artists as a kind of continuation of surrealism. And you may not have an answer to this question, but I'm actually really interested in why on earth is everyone so interested in surrealism? A, full stop. But also, why on earth is everyone interested in surrealism when there is a world war on? And I don't know. I don't have a specific answer to that question, and maybe we can venture to this. There's a way in which it feels like the arts are turning internally and going back to some of these mythologies, not just the political fictions of innocence, but the stories of oh, I'm sorry, I'm totally forgetting the story of Demeter's daughter. Persephone, exactly, and Orfeo. They're going back to these stories at probably the most fraught time in Western history.
Agreed, and I think that inward turn to mythology and to psychoanalysis and to the unconscious, I would argue, is not a turn away from the political. I think it is absolutely a kind of deep desire to understand the contemporary moment. And so I think maybe one of the things that we are jettisoning is this idea of a kind of binary of something that is either political or it is abstract, something that is either engaged in the kind of politics of that moment or it is turning inward toward poetry, symbolism, surrealism. And I think, those narratives have long shaped a kind of easy understanding of American art history and indeed art history at large. They are underpinned by the kind of high modernist criticism that you outlined, but those turns inward don't ignore what is beyond the self, I think.
Yeah, and that's true. And I think a lot of people were actually really asking this question of themselves in World War II. How is it that sort of Western civilization keeps undergoing these sort of genocidal and homicidal cycles? Why is that the case? And if anything, it was also, I think, the hope of maybe Solomon Guggenheim, Peggy's aunt, that there could be an art in the world that would change people's minds, change people's interiority. But I agree with you that what we have at this moment is this unfortunate split between abstraction and figuration. Abstraction as apolitical, maybe a neo-realistic or social realistic work as political. And those splits were absolutely false.
Yes, I think so. And as you walk today through the Peggy Guggenheim collection, you can see that there aren't ruptures between the kind of early abstract expressionist paintings that feel more akin to figuration or at least symbolism and those kind of overall patterning. In fact, those are part of the same conversation. And I suppose in trying to kind of think through Pollock's Enchanted Forest, it's not to argue for that as a representational painting, which it's not, but it's to argue that it has a relation with the world, and that the kind of patterning involves our entanglement with the world around us, that abstraction is not an absenting. The collection as it's hung today shows us that, and the roster of artists that Guggenheim showed in her galleries reinforces it, perhaps through a kind of the ongoing relevance of surrealism. And I'm not a surrealism scholar. I know that historians of surrealism often argue for its ongoing continuation and relevance in our contemporary moment, and surrealism as a kind of ever-expansive set of ideas and practices, but with real politics to it.
I would say that, I mean, you brought up Signor Racine earlier, Lorna Simpson's exhibition now, the Punta Doana, which I would say is a practice where she absolutely takes up the language of surrealism to think about the register, particularly of Black women throughout history and their sort of agency, like making them heroic, putting them in odd shapes and odd spaces, these uncanny spaces, and maybe asking the audience, why does this feel weird to you? Bless you. You just said something really interesting as well, which is there's a way in which maybe these stories that are told through these presentations, these histories, the rosters, the exhibitions that we may even see in Peggy Guggenheim's projects begins to reinforce a certain kind of narrative, a very specific narrative. And I'm also interested, as you and I have discussed, in, well, what were those other narratives that were possible that we kind of don't hear about of that moment? And we both started to go into some examples, bringing in artists. I love this sort of artist, George Morrison, that you brought up. I talked about sort of Black artists that were there at these sort of foundational moments, but kind of don't get sort of inscribed into history. I don't know, this is a practical question, but how do we go about that work of filling in the gaps? And should we even in certain cases?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and there's been a huge amount of work done by scholars thinking through the way in which modernism both occludes but also absolutely relies on the othering of artists and makers.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What do you mean relies on
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting. We see, white modern artists who are relying on objects from Africa, from Oceania, from the Americas, and some of those objects are in Guggenheim's collection, to kind of forge a visual and cultural style that is kind of predicated on a primitivizing set of tropes. We also can think about those artists who are absolutely present in the contemporary moment, in the post-war moment in New York, who are exhibiting, but perhaps not in the same spaces as their white peers. I think those gaps are important to observe. I think there is a more complex and nuanced approach than just kind of filling them in or slotting into the collection. And we talked about women artists as well, didn't we, who feature very frequently in exhibitions at Art of this Century, but not so much in those works that enter the collection. There is a kind of process of recovering those stories. And we've also talked about the way in which those stories often reside in archives that are difficult to access or may cease to exist. But I think we can also think about those tensions productively, actually. We can think about the way in which the works in the collection and the practices of Guggenheim herself open up and potentially make space now that perhaps was not possible in the 1940s and the 1950s, there is a kind of need, I think, to tell all of those stories. One of the things that struck me actually was how much more nuanced actually that set of stories is if you go back to it. That we assume that those absences are there for good, and they're not.
Right. I think the first thing is to recognize the absence. Right. We cannot assume that people were the only ones that were there. I think that's just a basic research and history tool. And the second one, of course, is find the archives. But that's the hard work. I mean, you and I get paid for this. But
right.
What do we do as sort of art lovers? What do we do as sort of armchair scholars? Like, how do we find this work?
Well, I think the first people who are finding it are the archivists, actually, are the people who are saving those histories, who are recording oral history testimony, who recognize that those figures who were not well seen and well recognized in their moment are important historically. We're lucky as historians when archivists and librarians have gone before us and done that work. I think there is always a question about how and why a collection came to be. And even without going into an archive, even as a kind of a sort of generalist visitor to all museums and galleries and collections, there is always the question of what is not there, or who is not, whose story is not being told. And I think those are really important. I think as a historian of American art, I'm interested in the way in which even works by artists like Pollock or Still speak to the kinds of cultural and political and ideological mechanisms by which there are those who aren't made to belong. Does that make sense? So
you might have to go a little deeper into that.
Yeah, so I got halfway through that sentence. So we look at those works and we think about the way in which they envision or construct a particular idea of Americanness, a particular category of American art. And it's not just that these works happen to have been included and other works happen not to be included, but that these works speak to the very structures by which some are not part of that conversation. And so there is a kind of diagnostic, I think, element to writing those histories also, that we look for the gaps and we identify the gaps, but we also understand the structures by which those gaps are created. And we can look to the kind of modernist paintings that we've looked at today for some of those indications.
Yes, and also to remember that the lack does not mean a lack of, let's say, quality or availability. I do remember, no names mentioned, hearing statements like, well, if black artists were there, I would have known about it, from certain professors, right? Or if women artists were as good as the male artists, then they would have been in certain collections. I mean, these are real comments. I'm not making these things up. And so it's not just about recognizing the absences, but also, as you rightly say, thinking about the attitudes and structures that produce absences, not necessarily assuming that those are natural, those blank spaces.
And so what do you do with the kind of proximity that you have laid out? So an artist like Hale Woodruff, it's not that he's in a completely different space. It's that he is really there in the heart of it. And we see that with women artists also. We see it with indigenous artists who are showing in some of those same spaces. So these are not separate histories, but they are absolutely entangled. It's just that historically we have chosen to see parts of that history.
Well, the first thing I would do is maybe offer a little bit of an addendum to some of the questions that were even raised by the Lunder Institute, which is, if they're asking, what is the state of American art? I would ask, what is the state of American arts, plural? And to recognize always that these histories are plural, that there will be multiple strands, and as you say, sort of multiple parts that put together that make a whole. I think this is probably true everywhere on Earth, that there's no singular history. The second thing that I get very excited about doing, of course, is making these exhibitions. And I think a lot of institutions are about making exhibitions like, oh, the women of abstract expressionism, the black surrealist. I mean, these are sort of common, sort of, let's say, curatorial tactics, which I think are fun. They're great, and again, begin to fill out the archives that you want. But one of the things that I had to learn as a curator, and especially as an art historian, is that one can make really wonderful, productive relationships to the history that we know. So we kind of know the history of ABEX. Not all of it, by all means. But that we try not to justify the presence of these artists through the history that we know. So we don't say things like, these women were just as good as the boys, right? These black people were just as good as the boys, right? No. We have to be very clear that our standards can't just be the history that, as you rightly say, certain structures produced for us. But the best part is, this is what gives us work to do. Right? I love art history because there's always more stories to go back and discover again and again and again.
And even with these histories that we think are set and think are canonical, there are new things to discover, but also new ways to approach them and new positions to take. But I think that it is a really important point, that we would never want to take that canonical history of Pollock and friends as the established thing against which we measure all of the other production. And in some senses, that is also about letting go of those categories of something that is abstract or figurative, something that is political or not, something that is European or American, and blurring those distinctions and pushing back against easy categories. Absolutely, I think American arts, or the arts of the Americas, I think to think even of the United States as one thing is bewildering. And I think, we see that plurality not just now, but absolutely historically. And I would insist, I think, on that acknowledgement that it's not that it was one picture and now it's more complicated, but it has always been that plurality and that complexity and that nuance and that sense of plurivocality, multiple voices, multiple people, multiple artists, and also many, many people behind the scenes, the educators and the gallerists and the collectors whose presence and labour is often felt implicitly and behind the scenes, that maybe we see now in a way that was not always apparent at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into something. But the last thing I want to say to your point about sort of the new inclusivity in our history is that it's also possible to look at younger artists, contemporary artists, the artists who have been occluded or not included in this canonical history as a way to read the canonical history too. I mean, I was really excited when I began to think about Mark Tobey's work through someone like Mark Bradford. Tobey was always thought of as a calligrapher, someone thinking about sort of automatic writing in a surrealist sense, thinking about East Asian calligraphy traditions as a way to think about like moving across paper, moving across a canvas. But then I thought, oh, these are maps. These are aerial views. And I got that looking at and thinking through Mark Bradford. So it's also those new histories that give us new perspectives on the past. But you just brought up a really interesting point about labor. Sort of behind the scenes folks, the people who help put these histories together but may not be acknowledged. And the great thing about sitting here, of course, and the occasion of being invited by the Peggy Guggenheim Collection is that we're thinking about the labor of a woman who was able to literally push art history in a certain direction. And that wasn't her intent. I mean, she was an incredibly driven woman, incredibly smart, really moved through instincts. But she didn't say, I'm going to work out a new American art history. When she opened the Art of the Century, she was just pushing something she believed in, and that actually started to pivot the stories that we got to tell about art histories. And as such, you and I actually started thinking about some other sort of contemporary women who might be doing something of the same. So this is our little sort of maybe rollout call, hallelujah call, to think about some of the labor that some of these women might be doing now. They're in no particular order, but of course we're in Italy, so why not start with Miuccia Prada? What would you call her labor, actually, now? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but...
You have put me on the spot.
So sorry.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there is a sense in which, and actually maybe this applies to all of the women that we are highlighting, and we should say this is not all of the women. There are, many, many figures out there. There is a kind of, we talk about Peggy Guggenheim as a collector, sometimes as a gallerist, but actually I think there is a championing that all of these women like Guggenheim do. And that is about championing individual artists, but it's about championing the role of art as a force, as something that is important, as something that deserves attention. And I think that sort of, I don't want to say advocacy, I think that's maybe overstating it, but a kind of championing, a profile raising, not just of individuals, but of the very idea of contemporary art, of international contemporary art, of the art world as something that is necessary.
Very good answer on the spot.
Well, we're in Venice. I feel like this is the answer. For
the necessity of art, but maybe also, to put it more bluntly, curatorial programming.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that this isn't just about a collecting practice, but actually foregrounding programs that help us think through individual artist practice, but again, as you rightly say, the importance of contemporary artists now. Kamal Shah is another woman that we thought of. And if I were to sort of talk about her labor, she is someone who very early on in her collecting career decided to focus exclusively on women. Not just in the U.S. where she lives and works, but internationally, and so has made it really her point to put together a major, major international collection solely made up of women, and then moving on, of course, sponsoring exhibitions, publications, think tanks even, around women's work. Who else do we have? Oh, Manuela Hauser. I mean...
Yes, and I think, again, in all of these cases, there is also a sort of sense of vision. I'm minded of Guggenheim, the name of Guggenheim's gallery, right? Art of this Century, which is a bold move halfway through a century. But that sense that I think these are figures who are aware of posterity and the way in which their actions, their collecting, their support of artists, their patronage, which is an old-fashioned term, but I think that's what it is, makes things possible for individual artists, but actually also for art history. And I think that is something that is not often recognized in the moment, but is something that, as we look back, we can see that sense of history and posterity.
I think that's really important also to recognize that the art world is an ecology, I call it, and that it's made up of many different parts. And Peggy's function as both a collector, but also as an art dealer, also someone who thought of herself as really running what was a kind of proto-museum, was really important, and that these things become tied together. The commercial side, the academic side, the intellectual side, the making side, all that actually becomes a fulsome necessity for putting art forward. I think the last one, and I love the fact that everyone's matching their art collections and these images. The last one that we included is Pamela Joyner, another U.S.-based person who has really spent her collecting career as it was focusing on African-American artists, starting with the Washington Color School, and then moving globally. And when I say African-American, I also mean the length of the Americas. She's moved through the U.S., through Latin America, now even focusing on South America, looking at Black diasporic artists and really making that the center of her collecting and exhibition sponsorship. And so I would say watch this space in another 50 to 100 years to see what people are sitting here talking about the influence of these women's work would be.
Maybe this is a good moment to open up to questions and thoughts from our audience. I think there is a roving microphone so that those who are joining us online can hear your question. Is it working?
Thank you so much, Naomi and Lucy, for this wonderful talk, this wonderful conversation. I think we're so thrilled, to being here, and you raised so many questions for us to think about. As the curator of the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, of course, I also think about Peggy Guggenheim herself as one of the greatest collectors of the 20th century, who still remains such a great inspiration for so many collectors working today. And I think, working with the collection, I always find new questions, new surprises. For instance, you talked so much about her Art of the Century Gallery Museum in New York, where, of course, she showed not just men artists. You had Virginia Admiral and Janet Sobel, who inspires Jackson Pollock, and Irene Rice Pereira. So many of the women had exhibitions there, and half the programming, I would say, was devoted to them. But not many works end up in the collection later on. It's mainly male. I think this was one of those surprises for me, over the years. Can I ask you, for instance, for you, in the process of preparing for this talk, what were some of the surprises and questions that came out to you that made you think anew, I think, about that very moment, I think, or maybe certain of the artists that you didn't think about so much before?
Oh, man. 3,000 surprises and questions. If you were to ask the surprises about, let's say, Peggy, first of all, in particular, Peggy Guggenheim, I'm learning to also use women's surnames because this is often not the case when we talk about art history. I think the first thing that was a surprise to me was, given her deep, deep, deep impact on, again, what became known as American modernism, it just surprised me to realize it never occurred to her that she was writing American art history. It never did. She really thought about this gallery, the Art of the Century, as an extension of her collecting practice. As I said, it was named after her book, but also her project in London, Guggenheim Jean, of course. There's an excellent exhibition on view right now, the Peggy Guggenheim Collection. So she really was doing this project of thinking about the continuity of avant-garde practice that she saw kind of coming out of Europe and then sort of manifesting itself in the United States. So she saw, instead of a break, continuity. And I think that was a really fascinating surprise to me, that her ambition wasn't really the kind of radical break that is often acknowledged, ascribed to her. But I still think we need to acknowledge the grand ambition of it. If I were to ask myself the biggest surprise in sort of researching this, it was really more the history question. The ways in which, as we kind of talked about a little bit, there are these mythologies that began to shape the way our history is discussed and forms. And the sort of American innocence mythology has a history. And, of course, it starts at the moment of American independence, right? This scrappy little nation in the 18th century, committed to Enlightenment ideals, will never behave as Europe did, right? Never. Number one. But, of course, there are writers, historians, even fiction writers, who began to kind of create this mythology that starts to show up in about 1840, 1850. And then it begins to seep away, but shows up again almost exactly a century later in 1940, 1950, exactly the same time that you see the art of the century in the world, exactly the same time critics are starting to write again about the empty space, the frontier. And the first time, the 1840s and 50s, was during Manifest Destiny, exactly the time the U.S. was saying, we're going to move from the east across the west, and guess what? There's no one there. It's just land for our taking. And then in the 1940s and 50s, again, it is the story of that we have a kind of culture where there was no history. We never behaved like Europe. And so that was a surprise to me, to think about the ways in which we can talk about history being cyclical, but I could actually see it in the research, in the writing, in the commentary, in the criticism. And it's something that actually gives me a bit of hope. If we know that certain mythologies pop up at certain times during certain pressure points in American history, and there may be moments now where this sort of ascendant story of American innocence, American good, becomes a part of the cultural landscape, well, then we know that other stories may follow, and other histories may follow, and that it may be the hard work of having to work against those stories again and uncover those unknown and underknown and underrecognized stories. But it is possible, and it's work we have to do.
Absolutely agreed. And I think in the field of American art history, there is this real understanding that it's very difficult to look at art made in the middle of the 20th century without acknowledging the way in which it is intimately linked to the 19th century. I think the surprises for me are probably way more banal than that, which was, well, I suppose that there are kind of two ways of saying this. The first is how much she managed to do, both with Guggenheim Jeune and Art of this Century, in such a short space of time. So many exhibitions, and I was sort of horrified and terrified to learn that across 18 months in London, she staged 21 exhibitions, which is just incomprehensible to me today. But I was also really struck by how many of the artists that she was showing, especially in the New York gallery, were artists whose work I did not know. Artists who had just kind of fallen out of the way that American art history is taught. And that was an exciting discovery for me, but also a very kind of salutary one, that I think I know the history of American art in the post-war moment, of abstract expressionism, and of course I don't. And there is still so much to be retrieved from those archives. And I had I think, one picture of what Art of this Century had done, and what emerged was something much, much more nuanced and much more complex, and with many, many more artists that she supported than I had realized or than I thought I knew, which as a historian is I mean, it's a kind of wonderful position to be in, but it also says a lot about the way in which that field has been taught, I think, and studied.
If I can add one more thing as we tee up the next question. I didn't know about the artist sessions at Studio 35. I didn't know the artists sat down to discuss what they were doing and trying to literally write their own history and give a name to themselves. I didn't know that existed. And I was so shocked when I found out about it, I literally thought AI had dreamt it up. And that the algorithm was like, oh, I know what Naomi needs. She needs to hear about the secret, like, sort of gathering of all these artists with Alfred J. Barr. And there was a black man there. I really thought AI created it.
But what is more sinister, AI or Clement Greenberg?
Way more Clement Greenberg, yeah.
Hi, thank you both for a great discussion. Naomi, going to your original, does that sound okay? Going to your original beginnings of the story and the kind of the American painters dealing with the lodestar of Europe and how they were trying to manage that and somehow rejecting it or accepting it and how they're working. At the same time, you had the artists from Europe arriving, bringing surrealism, etc. But what I was thinking about, is there not a reverse kind of commute with African Americans going to Paris? And we think of James Baldwin, it's a bit later, and jazz musicians searching for some kind of peace without the racism. Were there African American painters also going? And I'm wondering how they engaged with the European lodestar.
Excellent question. So absolutely, there was a two-way commute going back and forth, starting with like World War One, really, not just World War II, but World War One. The examples I know of, believe it or not, are really more sculptors than painters. The first one I think of is Edmonia Lewis, who started going to Europe in the 19th century, France, Italy especially, and really ended up here in Rome, and Stromboli actually became a space.
And Scotland?
Yeah, that's right. But I think she was following like Frederick Douglass or something. Yeah, exactly. And interestingly enough, she's taking up the style of European classicism, very naturalistic, very mannered, but the stories of the United States. And the story for her was actually not a black history. She rarely depicted African diasporic figures in her work, but Native Americans were her primary subject. And I think that's a fascinating kind of sort of cultural adoption and exchange that came to the States. The other one, oh, crikey, I just forgot his name. He was in my head as soon as you asked that question. Come back to me at dinner. And then we'll send out notes about this. But the artist that I'm also particularly thinking of was a queer artist, a black queer artist working in Paris, and also doing a lot of work around the male figure, which I think of course, as another sort of classicist example of way of looking at a body. That was a long tradition in sculptural practice. However, I think it was also a way for him to do this work of admiring the male body openly. In this practice. And so I do think there are ways in which we could also start, reading a kind of practice in Europe from African American artists. Absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much for the conversation. You mentioned this concept of like American history being circular and histories being circular in general, and I was wondering if you think that any of the patterns of these artists that you have been speaking about from the mid-1900s are appearing today in contemporary modern American art.
So I may not have been absolutely super clear in the presentation at the end of my talk, but one of the things that I was doing was setting up a little bit of exactly an argument about your question. So, my bad, we don't have birth dates for these artists here. But Shanique Smith was born around 1977. So she is a woman who is probably now in her early 50s, late 40s, early 50s. So is a contemporary artist, contemporary African-American artist, deeply invested in exactly those questions that I was speaking about that Mark Tobey raised in the 1960s in this work. But this practice, this kind of all-over calligraphic practice, started for him in the 1940s. So what you see again in this setup is the example of Tobey showing up in the work of contemporary artists like Mark Bradford, born in the 1960s, probably born about the time this work was made, and insisting as an African-American contemporary artist that he would use the language of AbX to then talk about, in this case, the movement of black people across America during the Great Migration, which was a movement around World War II from mostly the South to the North. I also talked about an artist like Rashid Johnson, who has a really multifarious practice, but in particular has really looked at the work of someone like Dubuffet or even Fautrier, and the ways in which they have this deeply experimental way of working with materials, A, and B, they have a sort of faux naif language that is pretending to make work pretending like they didn't know how to draw, essentially. And so Rashid Johnson has taken up this exact kind of language in his contemporary artwork, born 1977. And then the last, or the first in this case, artist that I spoke about was someone like Kara Walker, born, I think, 1967, and an artist who's really used the language of early American art, especially cameo making, like sort of silhouettes and cameo traditions, but also has really looked to a history of surrealism, looking to dreams, looking to the darkest parts of her psyche, and of course, looking to the women who've come before her, who've looked at that language before to talk about inequity, to talk about violence against women. So absolutely, you see these being taken up in these like few examples, but we can go on for days about the ways in which these artists are not only looking to the past, but in doing so, making a very strong argument about what it means to be seen within the great American tradition, not separate from it, but very much influenced by and within it.
I think that's right. Just to add that I think that for the contemporary artists that you spoke about and those that I mentioned, and absolutely that list could go on all evening, there is absolutely that awareness of their place in this category and history of American art, with its exclusions and its contradictions and its tensions. And so those artists who are picking up abstraction, in some senses, cannot do that without grappling with the legacy of that mid-20th century work, but nor would they want to, because in some senses they are making work very consciously in that category, in that trajectory. Just as I think it's very difficult to look at mid-20th century American art without thinking back to the 19th century. So I think that work that is being made now comes with all of that weight of history and a way of contending with the kind of mythologies that underpin that history.
I guess no more questions. So thank you so much. Now, while leaving the Teatrino, there is a small reception for everyone, so you're more than welcome to stay for like extra half an hour for a drink. Thank you so much again, Lucy and Naomi. Thank you, thank you.